I'm delighted to be here. My name is Shin Lebe. I am French, but I work for an international company based in the US called NewsGuard, and I lead their editorial operations in France and in Canada. And I'm gonna tell you basically what we do is we combat misinformation and disinformation online, and we help organizations, democracies, companies, but also individuals spot and avoid misinformation. So I'm gonna just present you a few things about how to spot misinformation online when it comes to your own navigation, and also present our tool, which can be used by you guys to that purpose. And so just about me, I'm a journalist, and the company that I work for is composed of journalists. So what we do is really journalism based to combat misinformation. What I want to talk a little bit about today are several things. First, what is misinformation and why is it important to be aware of it? Then really the bulk of what I want to talk to you about today is how you can spot and avoid misinformation online. Also, what do we do and how can we support you in doing that? And ways of bringing our tool called NewsGuard to your community, to your home. And there are several ways of doing that. So I'll end up with that. So just to start, what is misinformation? I mean, I'm sure all of you have been exposed to misinformation. So when we talk about misinformation, we talk about false or inaccurate information that's not necessarily spread with bad intention, but that is spreading. When the pandemic hit in early 2020, lots of health misinformation about the COVID-19 in general, about the COVID-19 vaccines. And 3 years later, there is still a lot of misinformation about COVID-19, actually. But what I would say is that every large news event is really a moment where we see a lot of misinformation flourishing online. So that goes from the war in Ukraine, of course, has seen a lot of misinformation, but also climate change. And over the summer, we've seen a lot of misinformation about climate change because people were seeing, they were looking outside their window, seeing that it was raining and saying climate change is a hoax, that type of things. We've seen a lot of misinformation about the fires, for example, including the Canada fires, the truckers' protests in Canada. So I would say that really it's important to be aware of misinformation because every time there is a large event, and it doesn't have to be a world pandemic, there is misinformation flourishing online. And as I was saying, it's different from disinformation, but the reason when we talk about misinformation in general, it encompasses more. So when we talk about disinformation, it's really the false information that's being spread with ill intent, for example, by, governments as propaganda. So you can think about the Kremlin propaganda about the war in Ukraine, or you can think about people spreading false claims on purpose because they want you to believe that, for example, vitamin C will cure COVID, because actually on their website they're selling vitamin C. But it can also be just people actually genuinely believing in the false claims and sharing them, with no ill intention. But the result in the end is the same, is we're seeing these claims, spreading, becoming viral, and being dangerous. There's the issue of using people that people think they can trust. So either the image or the name, or share things that are either not related to them, or maybe there are people that we think we can trust, but actually they're talking about something they don't know. So that's a way also to spread false claims. That happened a lot during the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw lots of really reputable experts, former Nobel Prizes, that were spreading false claims about COVID because they were just not specialists of this specific pandemic. And the other thing, the problem of mislabeling of ads, and that's a big problem that we see today, is a lot of sites purposely or inadvertently, but I would say a lot purposely, mislabel ads. Either they will not label it at all, so you'll click on something thinking it's an editorial content when actually it's an ad. So this is very problematic. They're wanting you to buy something and you'll really thinking it's completely non-commercial. So that's a big problem. And or they'll label it with labels that are, you know, purposely quite confusing so that you don't really know the nature of, they'll say like partner content or this type of thing. So we're seeing that a lot. When it comes to an individual claim, it's really hard, and there's no like magic method to find out if something is true or false. What we do is just, you know, basic journalism. So we'll go and we'll call, if, you know, if someone says, I don't know, this guy has said so and so, we'll just call the guy and say, did you say that? Or if, you know, it says that he said something in a conference, we'll just watch the conference and check, has he actually said that? So it's a lot of reporting, and it takes a lot of time, and that's why often it can be discouraging a bit, because, you know, it's really fast to spread a false claim. It's really long and time consuming to debunk it and to show why it's false. And especially when it comes to health and medical information, it's really complicated. You have to go back to scientific studies, and it takes a lot of time, study them, examine them, dissect them. And so I think that's why we're seeing so many false claims win in a way and flourish, because it's just faster to spread those lies. False claims are popular all over the world, and what's interesting is they'll be popular across countries, across languages. So maybe you'll read something on your Facebook page in Ontario, and then someone in France will be reading the same claim in French, and someone in the middle of Thailand will also be reading the same thing. So for example, claims like vaccines cause autism, or there is a great reset plan to use COVID-19 measures to control the population. We've seen those all over the world. We've also seen a lot of claims that are Canada specific, and we're seeing that in every country. And that's why I think you have to really be aware, because then it's even harder to know. It could be, some are Canada specific, some could be specific to your neighborhood. And then it's harder to find someone who's debunked it, fact-checked it, and then how do you know? So that's why you have to build some resilience against misinformation. And that's why I'll try to give you a few tools for that. And so for a few examples of Canadian specific claims that we've found in our work, I just shared a few here. We have a database where we list the most popular false claims that circulate online. It has about 1,500 popular myths, and a dozen are Canada specific. So for example, I was just talking about the Great Reset Plan that has been popular all over the world. But in Canada, we've also seen the claim that the Canadian government has a Great Reset Plan. So just adapting this claim to Canada. We've seen other claims, like here I shared one about Ukraine, this claim that a Canadian sniper who's known as Wally was killed in Ukraine by Russian special forces. So the guy exists, he's actually French Canadian, and he's a former sniper, and he is fighting in Ukraine, but he's not dead, or at least when this was, I don't know about today, but when this was going viral online, he himself denied and said, no, I'm very well alive. And we have no clue how this started. It just started on social media, and we don't know where this came from. So sometimes it's just, you know, organically born, and we don't really understand how. Sometimes it comes from something that actually happened that will be misrepresented or distorted. So a good example of that was this claim here that I've listed here about Ontario doctors supposedly suggested that the unvaccinated should be given psychiatric medication. So this came from a real guidance from it was the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. And the guidance was discussing whether we should recommend that patients that say that they refuse to be vaccinated because of a fear of needles should be either medicated or offered therapy. So it was not about the pandemic, and it was not suggesting that, you know, the ones who refuse vaccination were mentally ill at all, but it was just misinterpreting an existing document. So there was something that it started from. And then another example that I shared here is this idea that doctors at a Canadian hospital had died from COVID-19 vaccine. So this was pretty random, but 3 doctors at one hospital, it was the Trillium Health Partners in Ontario, they died, the 3 of them died within a few days. So it was it was weird, but two of them died of cancer, and one of them had been ill for a very long time. And so they were dead. It's true that it was, unusual that three doctors of the same hospital would die at the same period of time, but it was not related to COVID-19 vaccines at all. And the claim just continued on. And then once it spiraled, it's really hard to stop it. And I just put one other because I think it's interesting to see that, the claims can be very local, they can be very international, and even in things that seem remote from you. So the earthquake in Turkey, some misinformers found a way to link it to Canada. So there was the claim that 10 countries, including Canada, had pulled their ambassadors from Turkey 24 hours before the February 2023 earthquake that killed thousands of people in the southeast of Turkey and the north of Syria. And so the idea behind this false claim was that, well, they pulled their ambassador because they knew it was going to happen. And some even claimed that the earthquake was planned and organized. And actually, the Canadian ambassador was there. He was very much in Turkey. And actually, only one of the 10 was not in Turkey at the moment. It was the Danish ambassador, but he was just in Copenhagen because he had a long planned surgery. So it was totally unrelated. So it's important, I think, to understand that a lot of false claims circulate. They can be very local. These are, I would say, national about Canada, but they can be even more local. And so you have to be aware that you can be targeted when you're navigating online. And it's important because you don't always know what you can trust online. It can be confusing. Which sources can you trust? What information is accurate? Is there an app that I can go to verify that information? It's not that simple, but sometimes we'd want that. And sometimes deter our ability to understand the news. And it can also put our health at risk. So something that we've seen is a lot of misinformation targeting older adults is about health. And so, of course, if you believe in a false claim about your health, it's more possible that you'll take some risks or you won't follow an important treatment because, you've read misinformation about it. And one piece of data that I always mention is during COVID-19, I think there was this intuition that misinformation about the vaccines would deter people from getting the vaccines, but we actually have proof. There was a study that was done and published by researchers in the UK that looked at people that were super determined to take the vaccine. So highly motivated people, really believed in the vaccine, wanted to take it. And they were exposed to false claims about the vaccine just a week before. And then there was a decline of about 6% in their intent to getting the vaccine. So it's very real. And I think it's also important just for you all to understand that why are we talking about this? Because we all have a role to play, right? When we share a piece of information, if it's misinformation, we're contributing to its virality. And the more it becomes viral, the more it can harm people around us, but just all over the world. And as I was saying just a minute ago, there's some myths are targeting specific age groups. So we were seeing that some myths are country specific or region specific, and some myths are specific about certain age groups. And we're seeing a lot of health related myths targeting senior citizens. Do you have any technique today to spot and avoid misinformation? Is there anything that you do when you navigate online? Do you look at something specific on the websites? Do you ask friends? So I think what I want to try and get across today is that we have to learn how to think critically about the source of information that we read online. And that's what we try to do in my company at NewsGuard. First, how do you get your news? Do you get it through social media? Do you go to a specific website that you know and trust? And when you read a piece of content, what do you look at? Is there something you look at to make sure it's reliable? If you're open one window on your browser, you can open another one and see. You can look at, okay, that I'm reading this on this source. Has anyone else written about this claim? If so, what are they saying? Does it look similar? If no one else has written about what you're reading and it sounds very sensational, there's a high probability that it's not true. Or if you're reading from a source that you've never seen before, maybe you can just Google that source and say, okay, what is that source? Has anyone written anything about it? Maybe your local fact checker will have written an article to say that it's a very unreliable source. So this practice of lateral reading, I think, has become really important today, because even for us journalists, it's become really hard we don't know all the sources that are circulating online, and it's really hard to distinguish them. Sometimes you have like a hidden agenda behind a site. You will have actually a unit of the military Russian intelligence, and you have no way to know unless you do a proper investigation. And then, of course, once you know, the whole coverage is sort of colored by who's speaking. But if you don't know that, it's really hard, and you can not really know what you're faced with and who's feeding up this news. So I think it's important today, really nowadays, to build these habits. Before sharing a link, what I always recommend to people is also always to pause for a few seconds before you share a link with anyone, because as we were just saying, when you share something, you contribute to its virality, and then the more a piece of content is viral, the more harm it can do. I was talking about it being difficult to recognize what's reliable, what's not. So this is a website from Canada. Maybe some of you know it, maybe not. It's called globalresearch.ca. There's a French version also that exists called mondialisation.ca. It looks very professional. It looks very reliable, I'd say. And it covers really complicated topics like war crimes, militarization, the US and NATO. It's very complex geopolitical stuff. But actually, we've rated that news site. So we've analyzed its content journalistically. We established that this website, which is the website of a nonprofit in Canada called the Center for Research on Globalization, has published false content, conspiracy theories, and pro-Russia propaganda. So that doesn't mean that any piece of content that you'll find on this website is false, of course, just as it doesn't mean that when you read CNN, every piece of content will be reliable. But it just means that if you know that, at least you can, take it with a grain of salt, do a little bit extra lateral reading, maybe if you're reading something there, and just make sure what you're reading, you're comfortable about the claims, and you know that they have this history of publishing false claims in the past. Again, who knows about this specific claim, but at least you have the context. So that's what we try to do at NewsGuard. We rate news websites at the source level. So instead of rating an individual claim, so for example, I'll go back, instead of looking at this site and say, okay, is it true that whatever is said in this article is true, we've rated the full website. We gave it a score out of 100, and we established what we call a nutrition label, which is basically a very long, lengthy analysis that tells you exactly why we've come up with that score, why we think this site fails or passes certain criteria, examples of content that it's published, why we think that content was false, responses from the website as well, because, maybe they disagree with us, and maybe the people who are going to use nutrition labels are going to disagree with us, and it's fine. But at least they have our analysis and they see the responses of the site, and then they can make up their mind and decide with a little bit extra information. So to do these nutrition labels, we have 9 criteria, and why we've decided to pick them and how we look at them. And as you'll see, what we do with that is that, so as I was explaining, we do nutrition labels for each site, and then they're available for the public. So, you can use us to sort of determine whether you can trust a source or not. But the reason why I think it's very important to look at our criteria in detail is that, yes, you can use us, but also very important is for you to build that resilience. So sort of, make those criteria yours and start looking for them when you're looking at a website. We see ourselves really not just as a tool that you can use, but also as building sort of a vaccine against misinformation. The more you'll read our stuff, the more you'll hopefully look at those things in a website and try to determine the overall credibility for yourself. We have 5 criteria of credibility and 4 criteria of transparency. And you'll see that for each criteria, we have a number of points that account to a total of 100, and they're weighed based on their importance. We haven't invented anything at all. They're pretty simple criteria of basic journalistic practice. The idea was really to distinguish between reliable news sites and unreliable news sites, sites that are trying to do things well and sites that are not trying at all, or that are purposely trying to spread false claims. The goal here for us was never to give good points of journalism or medals or honors. And actually some famous websites get scores that are less high than aggregators that just aggregate because they're less transparent, for example. So our role is really to distinguish between those that try and those that are not trying at all, not to be the police of any good journalism or anything like that. So the first criteria that we have is, does the site repeatedly publish false content? So that for a typical user is hard to do, but that's what we do for the users to be able to rely on us, because it's impossible when you go to a website to look at, okay, what has the site said about COVID? What has the site, you'd have to spend a lot of time. That's the work that we do. We'll read a lot of articles on the site, and we'll try to see, has the site pushed a lot of false claims, promoted a lot of false claims? When it has done so, has it corrected them later, or has it, let them on the site because it believed they were correct? So we'll look at a lot of content, and we'll, in our nutrition label, we'll explain, we'll add a lot of examples so that the reader, if we tell them that we think this site publishes a lot of content, repeatedly publishes false content, he doesn't have to believe us, he has the proof. And when we say repeatedly publish false content, that means that to fail that criteria, the idea is that really whatever given day you'll go on that site, there's a pretty high chance that you'll find false content. So it's not a site that will publish a few false claims here and there. It's really a site that, I don't want to say daily, because if it's a site that only publishes once a month, then if once a month when it publishes its false claims, then that's repeatedly for that website. And for websites that publish a lot, on any day, if you go, you'll find false claims. Then our second criteria, which is the second most important, is, does the site gather and present information responsibly? Again, here, that's really hard to do for just anyone looking at a site quickly, but that's where we use our journalistic expertise and experience, and we just look at, okay, does the site use a lot of anonymous sources extensively all the time, or does it actually cite its sources? Does it steal content from other websites without citing them? Does it plagiarize, basically? Or does it cite its source? When it's telling you according to a study, does it tell you which study, the date? Does it maybe even give you links to that study? But at least, does it give you some information that you can check the information? Or does it just say according to a study, no date, nothing, and then it's impossible to verify? A lot of websites will fail that criteria because, for example, they'll write stories about anecdotes about a woman that in a supermarket did that, and then there's no CT, there's no name, there's nothing, no way to verify the information. A lot of websites will also fail that criteria because they'll talk about stories that happened like 7 years ago as if they happened yesterday. Or we'll also have sites that publish a lot of false claims, but not repeatedly, not enough to fail on the first criteria. So we'll fail them on that second criteria, and they'll pass on the first criteria. Then the next criteria is, does the site regularly correct errors? And I think that's very important, because the difference between a responsible site and an irresponsible one is just that we all make mistakes. Every journalist do. And the difference between a journalist that wants to make things right and another one is just that they will correct their errors. So does the site correct their errors, but do they also tell you that they made an error and explain what was corrected, etc.? Then I think a very important one, and I think that for a reader is actually something that you can look at when you're reading an article on a site that you don't know, is that, does the site distinguish between news and opinion? So if you read a news article, it's labeled news. Does it use opinionated language? Does it have sentences that are really, really strongly opinionated, I don't know, pro-Russian, anti-Europe, or whatever, without labeling them as opinion? Or does it seem pretty responsible in the sense that there's a columns section, and then the rest of the news article are pretty neutral? That's something that's very important. We give a lot of points for that criteria, and that gives you a good idea, because a lot of websites that are not responsible will mix the two. And so it's something that you can look at, and you can practice developing a good habit of looking at, is the language opinionated or not, even in stories that are news stories. Then one that's obvious, and I think you probably already look at that, and that's something that we do when we do lateral reading, does the site avoid deceptive headlines? So if you see a crazy headline, very sensationalist, something that's really, striking, and then you Google it and you realize no one else has talked about that, then, maybe that's some red flag for you. A lot of gossip entertainment website will use very grabbing headlines. So the name of a pop star tells about her cancer, and actually her cousin's mom has cancer. So the article itself is correct and does not spread any false claim, but the headline is purposely grabbing and false to grab you in and make you click. And then we have 4 criteria of transparency, and I think these you should really try to you can really develop and look at and make it a habit of looking at when you surf online, and this can become sort of your misinformation vaccine, because it's easy to look at those things. It takes a few seconds and it'll give you really a good idea of the site, especially does the site disclose ownership and financing. If a site has zero about page, zero page that tells you anything about who's behind it, it's a big red flag. And a lot of our websites that get a very poor score in our database that we call misinformation sites do fail that criteria, as well as other credibility criteria. Because of course, websites that have nothing to hide, they'll just tell you who owns them. So I think that's something to look at, and an easy habit to develop. Okay, I'm on this site, I'm reading this article. Let's look at the rest of the site. Does it have an about page? Who's behind it? Do I have any idea? Another thing you can look at is, are the articles signed, or are the articles all anonymous? Is there any name behind this site, or does it look like no one's making the content? Again, it's, good newsrooms, good journalistic outlet. It's very rare that they don't have any name to go with their articles. Usually they will even have a biography or contact for the content creator. So if you have nothing, again, that can be a red flag. And then also the advertising can be also a red flag. Is there content that really looks like editorial content, but is actually sponsored content? And you read it, you feel like it's a news piece, and it's actually commercial content. That's also a red flag that you can look for when you look at an article. As I was saying, a lot of the credibility criteria that we use are a bit hard for you to do on the go when you're reading a news site. We spend a lot of time on those sites to determine this. But I think those transparency criteria, does the site have an about page? What does it tell me? Is it clear who writes the articles? Is it clear who's the editor-in-chief? Those small things can already give you a hint about the quality of a website, and give you a red flag if it's a site that seems to be a bit shady. So you'll navigate online and you can see, if you have installed our browser extension, you can see a little icon with the score out of 100. A blue icon that tell you here it's the Natural News Network. It's a network of sites that spread a lot of false claims about health and medicine. So you'll see that they get a 5 out of 100. Will tell you to proceed with maximum caution. And then you can see which criteria they pass, which criteria they fail. And then if you click on see the full nutrition label, you'll be able to read the nutrition label, which will give you the score, the list of criteria, a summary of what the site is, and then a little bit about the ownership. And then there will be a little bit about the content, a little bit about credibility, which will explain why the site is credible or not, a little bit about transparency, and then a little bit about history, because the idea is also for these things to be media literacy tools. So to help you, tell you anything interesting to know about this website. And then the idea is really that you can make up your mind. You can decide that, well, actually, I think that website is fair, or I agree with this rating, but I think that the article that I'm reading is credible. which is fine too, because as I was saying again, there's nothing as a website that's 100% of the time reliable or 100% of the time unreliable. It's often in the gray. And so it's just an indication and an added information for you, with the hope that you'll also develop those habits that I was telling you about. And so those ratings, and they can help you make your own decision. As I was saying, they can be helpful. I've had a lot of people tell me, actually, I don't use them myself because I'm pretty good at knowing what's reliable, what's not. But I share a lot of your nutrition labels with my family when they share articles with me. And that's been helpful because they will share an article and then they won't listen to me. But if I share a third party advice on it, then there'll be more listening. And the idea here is really, to help others in your network, and protect yourself. And so our tool, as I was saying, I hope that from this presentation you can get a few things that you can do on your own, but you can also use our tool if you want to. So it's a browser extension. You can get a subscription for it and install it. We are in Canada, we're in the US, we're in 9 countries overall, so most of your news diet should be covered by it. You can also, so it's a paid subscription, but it's available for free through Edge, because we have a partnership with Microsoft. So if you use Edge, you can download it for free. And another thing is that we have a pro bono program, a media literacy program with public libraries all over the world, where we just give them our browser extension to install for free on the computers that patrons use. So if you want to bring it to your local library, tell them, hey, you should install that. We'd be happy to give it to them for free and help them install it. So if you want to share that with your community as well, you're most welcome to share my contact, and they can get in touch.